Hello, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us today for this community conversation on issues surrounding diversity, equity, and inclusion. According to studies conducted by Pew Research, Gallup, Brown University, and countless other organizations, the national polarization that we are experiencing at this time in history is literally affecting every aspect of our functioning society. And while it is paramount that we seek to understand, embrace, and celebrate our human diversity, this conversation and our work is in the pursuit of doing it in a way that leads to unity. My name is Phil Gwoke, and I am the managing director at BridgeWorks, a consulting firm that has spent over 22 years helping to bridge generational divides that exist within organizations. I am joined today by my co-host, Scott Zimmer, a generational expert and keynote speaker with our firm. And together, we are so honored to share this platform with our guest, Richard Caturano, the national leader of culture, diversity, and inclusion with RSM. They're an organization, incredible group that I had an opportunity to do a project with, and they provide audit, tax, and consulting services to organizations literally around the world. We anticipate that this conversation will last about 45 minutes, and at that point, we want to take some time to answer your questions directly. Some of you have already submitted some questions, and we are going to do our best to get to absolutely every one of those that we can. In the process, if questions come to you that are top of mind, please enter them into the chat feature, which should be available to you. We'll be keeping an eye on those. And like I said, at the very end, get to all that we can. With that being said, Scott, why don't you tell our audience a little bit about how we got here before we ask our first question to our honored guest, Rich.
Sounds good. Thank you, Phil. Yeah, for all of you joining us who maybe are not familiar with BridgeWorks, a little bit about us. We are a generational research and consulting firm, like Phil said. Phil and I have both been with BridgeWorks now a long time as generational consultants and keynote speakers. We get to travel around the world doing great deliverables about bridging generational divides in the workplace. And I have to say, probably the best part of our job is that wherever we're speaking or whoever we're speaking to, it doesn't matter the industry, it doesn't matter the group of people that we're talking to, it could be interns, it could be leadership. What we love about what we do is that at the end of the day, this is something everyone can benefit from, because at one point or another, we've all had that moment where we've experienced a generational misunderstanding of some kind. And I think the thing Phil and I are most proud of is that we go into these organizations and our job is really not to wag our finger at any one generation and say, you're doing it wrong, this is how you need to be doing it. It's about creating a sense of understanding. And we do that by sort of not just talking about the what, what are these generational differences? We go deeper with it and we talk about the why, and we really try and create that sense of understanding and tell the stories of these different generations who we work with every single day, and then give actionable takeaways that people can use. And we always feel good knowing we left a company and left them with stuff that they can use and put into effect the very next day. And the topic of generations has so many parallels with the broader topic of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Maybe your organization calls it D&I, DE&I, I&D. I know a lot of organizations out there give it a lot of different names that mean something to them. However you refer to it, we feel sort of this kinship when it comes to the topic of generations and the topic of diversity and inclusion as a whole, because at the heart of it, it's creating a sense of understanding, getting to the heart of why, our different perspectives are the way they are and what shaped each and every one of us. And we always felt like generations is sort of a great safe space to start that conversation, which leads me actually to Rich. Thank you again for being here. For us, over the last few months, we've really been invested in the idea of generations and diversity and inclusion. And we've written a lot of blogs on it. We've had these community conversations that we're so lucky to have you here today participating in it. But we really want to get people who are leaders in the space of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And just looking at your resume, if you will allow me to read this, 5-time recipient of Accounting Today's 100 Most Influential People in Accounting, recognized by Winning Workplaces as one of the best bosses nationwide. Very nice. And helped establish the National Commission on Diversity and Inclusion. We are very excited to have you with us today. And I'm just going to start with asking you, how long ago did you get into diversity and inclusion, and really what sort of inspired it?
Well, thank you, Scott, for the nice introduction. And I got involved with diversity and inclusion back in 2011 when I was nominated as vice chairman of the AICPA, American Institute of CPAs. And when I looked around and thought about the different needs that needed to be addressed, diversity and inclusion came on my radar screen. I had attended a meeting of what at the time was called the Minorities Initiative Committee. And that particular committee didn't have much of a budget. They didn't have a really good sense of direction. And they really didn't have a lot of influence, I think, within the organization in order to really gain some headway and make some progress and move the needle. So I thought, well, you know, that's something that we really need to take a look at. There was a business case that kept popping in front of me about why diversity and inclusion would be important, not just because it would be the right thing to do, which is certainly always important, but also because there was a legitimate business case in looking to the future and looking at the changing demographics that DEI would be really important. So I set out on a mission to first understand more about it, because I was a novice in it. I grew up in an Italian neighborhood in a city that only had Italians, Irish, and Jewish people. That was it. I think we might have had one Black family in our entire city, and I wasn't exposed to a lot of diversity as a child. It was mostly friends and family and the Italian way of doing things. I couldn't imagine anybody not being Italian. And so when I undertook the journey, I realized how much I really did have to learn and how important it was, and how important it was going to be, you know, from a business perspective. So I made it my platform at the AICPA in my year as chairman, which is 2012 and 2013. And we looked forward, and we came up with a plan, and we established a National Commission on Diversity and Inclusion. Ken Boyer from EY was our first chairperson of the National Commission. And through people like Ken and others who were diversity professionals, I got my education. I sort of got my hands-on training and learned just so much about the whole topic, but also got to understand the different races and the different perspectives and where they were coming from and why they feel the way they feel and why we feel the way we feel, and all the different concepts like unconscious bias that I was totally oblivious to. So when my term as chairman was up in 2013, I was a partner at RSM. I went to Joe Adams, who was our CEO, and I said, you know, we need to do more about diversity and inclusion. And he said, I can't agree with you more. Are you willing to take it on? It's a tough challenge. I was told it would be a tough challenge when I took it on at the AICPA. I was told that it was something that if you want to take on diversity and inclusion, focus on the gender part of diversity and inclusion, not the racial part of it, because it's too controversial and a lot of people aren't going to accept it. And you know, when I talked to Joe about it, we said this is not going to be an easy journey, but we need to do it. And he agreed. He gave me the resources that I needed, and I reported directly to him. I became a member of the firm's leadership team, and the firm made it a strategic priority at that point. So that's sort of how I got started in it, and how RSM got started in it as well.
So one of the things that I really appreciated, Rich, when we first spoke with you is not only your passion, your story, but the fact that the projects that you've been involved in have led to real change, right? And our work as studying generational or societal shifts is all about keeping an eye on change and helping people navigate through change. In our experience, there's two responses to change. Either some people are really reticent, they push back, they don't want anything to do with change, they've gotten comfortable, they kind of like things the way they are. The other side of things is there are people who love change, they're embracing change, but they don't really know how to go about effectively navigating that. And we've kind of developed a formula that we feel helps work. But I want to read to you a question that came in preparation for today, and something I think you can really speak to. And I'm just going to read it directly as the person shared it with us. She says, what are some resources for ensuring a culture of inclusion for employees of Hispanic descent? I've seen a lot of Black inclusion lately, but not much about Hispanic inclusion. I work in an area where a large percentage of our staff is first-generation American with immediate family from Mexico, and I'm a white chick from the oil fields of Texas. And the reason, while we probably don't have time to get into all the nuances of each culture that was shared, the reason I wanted to share this question is when we first met you, you told us about your journey, as you just described, growing up in a neighborhood where you weren't exposed by your own admission to a lot of different lenses of diversity, and yet you went on a personal journey of understanding. And so my question is, when it comes to this evolution of you going from a leader in accounting to a leader in culture, diversity, and inclusion, what challenges did you personally face and have to overcome? And how did you go from kind of like this person's story? I don't come from that culture, and yet now I'm a leader within it. What advice would you give her to she wants to embrace change, she doesn't know how?
Yeah. Well, I can relate to that. When I first got involved, I was known as the straight, bald white guy who was in charge of diversity and inclusion. So I wasn't checking any boxes at the time. And there was a lot that I needed to learn. And I think the first thing you really need to understand is the magnitude of what it is that you need to learn. There's a lot. Because there are a lot of different aspects to diversity and inclusion. As you mentioned, you have generational diversity, you have gender diversity, you have all different kinds of diversity. And so we needed to learn a lot about all those different types of that affect diversity and inclusion. By the way, with respect to the Hispanic voice in the diversity and inclusion world, I think the Hispanic population in the United States is the fastest growing demographic. And we do need to pay attention, a lot of attention to the Hispanic voice in America. And we do in RSM. Certainly we have one of our employee network groups is called the OLA group. And it's one of our most active employee network groups. And they're involved a lot with mentoring. They're involved a lot with pronunciation skills to help Hispanic people in terms of pronunciation. But when the Hispanic group is a hardworking first-generation group, as she mentioned, and it's a valuable asset to our firm. It's a really valuable asset to our firm and our society in general. So, we can't overlook that, and we need to pay attention to that. And like I said, all the aspects of diversity and inclusion. But, my advice is to surround yourself, if you're really interested in it, with people who have been on the journey, so to speak. So have conversations with people of a different race or a different gender or a different sexual orientation. Have those conversations and find out what it's like to be like them. What is it like? Learn about the concept of unconscious bias and how it affects them. Learn about the concept of microaggressions and why people react so strongly to something that most people would think is a very innocent comment. Why is it that you react so strongly to that? And we could talk a little bit more about microaggressions, but that's something that's really important, is to understand why they act so strongly to that. And it was described to me by one person as, well, it's sort of like a mosquito bite, right? You get a mosquito bite and it doesn't really bother you, but imagine getting 1,000 mosquito bites, and at some point your body's going to swell up and you're going to have a pretty bad reaction to that many mosquito bites. And that's what it's like. It's like it's constant. It's every day. And when you have those microaggressions every day, they add up and they start to hurt. And just understanding that is important as to why, and thus gives you a greater ability, a greater tolerance to different races and different generations and all the differences that we have in this country. So my advice would be, like I said, surround yourself, have those difficult conversations, and then read as much as you can about it. There are a lot of good books out there that address these concepts, and there's a lot to read. There are a lot of blogs, like the blog that you're putting out all the time and on the generational differences is fabulous, because it really leads to helping us understand each other better and having those difficult conversations. But it's really a learning journey, and we all need to go on that learning journey, and we all need to better understand ourselves and others in a whole different way. So when I look back at my career, 40+ year career, and I've done accounting, I've done auditing, I've done taxes, I've done business valuation, I've serviced thousands of clients, we've hired thousands of people that have launched a career, we've helped make a lot of people successful. The most rewarding thing I've done in the 40+ years has been my journey on diversity and inclusion over the last 8 years. Because I'm a different person because of it. I'm more understanding. I've learned so much. And I think that deeper understanding has really helped me as an individual.
All right. Rich, thank you so much for that. I really appreciate that. I know for Phil and I, when we initially meet with a client, our goal is always to find out what are your needs. And every client is different. Sometimes they want us to come in and address recruiting, retention, motivation. How do we engage? How do we work on our culture, communication, knowledge transfer? It's different for every client. But in 2020 alone, the ask is starting to change and it's starting to evolve a little bit. One of the questions that came in prior to our discussion, somebody had wrote, I'm very interested in social justice, racial and economic inequality as a subject matter, and how to help facilitate conversations and action that helps lead to systemic change. Mm-hmm. In 2020, conversations are getting tough. People don't always know what to say. They're worried about saying the wrong thing. They don't know if they have all the answers, which puts a tremendous amount of pressure on someone like you in your situation. Can you talk to me about how you address these difficult conversations in our current climate?
Yeah, I think the difficult conversations are by nature, by name, one of the most difficult things to do. And yet they're probably one of the most important things that we can do in companies and in society in general, because they create that better sense of understanding. And yeah, many people do feel like they're walking on pins and needles. And so let's take, for example, on the racial diversity and inclusion, difficult conversations. And let's just take black versus white, just as an example, because that's in the last couple of months, that's really come to the surface. And black people feel like if they're bringing their point up and they're trying to express themselves, then there's a word that I've been taught not to use with respect to black people. It's the M word, not the N word, the M word. And the M word is, I'm going to say it, so please pardon me for saying the M word is militant, right? So a lot of Black people are afraid to speak up because they'll be perceived as being militant. And I've come to understand that because I've seen that happen. I've seen Black people speak up about issues, and then there's a side conversation going on, and that word is used. And in the same respect, white people want to ask questions and talk about things that would be perceived as perhaps racist or a microaggression or something that's inappropriate. And so white people usually avoid the conversations directly and having people understand. And so we've got to get around all that and bring people together to have frank and difficult conversations where we express our feelings. And so one of the things we do at RSM is we have a saying called suspend your right to be offended when we enter into one of those conversations. So we say to each other, we know you're offended by what's going on. We know you're offended by a lot of things in this world, but we're going to have a conversation. And if I say something that isn't appropriate, you need to not be offended by it, but tell me why you feel that way instead. So let me know, let me understand why that's offensive to you. And if I can understand that better, then I will avoid it in the future. And I will understand why you're so sensitive to that. And a lot of those come in the form of what we call microaggressions again. But if I were to, let's just have everybody in the audience for a minute, please suspend your right to be offended. If I were to be involved with a conversation with let's say a town hall meeting, and I were to ask a Black person, about the rioting and about the illegal things that happen at some of these peaceful rallies, that's offensive. That's offensive because it has nothing to do with the person who's on our panel. It has nothing to do with the person who's speaking. And it has nothing to do with 99% of the Black people who are in America. And yet they feel that they're being asked to answer for it or defend it or justify it. And that's not what we're trying to do. We're trying to understand more about why that's offensive to you. And if you could just explain that, then I think people would help understand it a little bit better. And it goes in reverse. Why is it in the other direction? Why is it that if I say, we need to be bold and go after this cause, why am I looked at as being out of line if I'm asking to do that and if I'm a Black person? So those are tough things to overcome, frankly. And it's the same thing with if it's LGBT and heterosexual group. It's the same thing whether it's one generation versus another generation. It's difficult. And so I would say that leading those conversations really help people begin from a point of inclusion. But you have to feel safe talking about it. You have to feel like you're not going to make the headline news. I have to feel like I'm not going to lose my job at RSM because I use the M word, right? And you have to feel that those conversations need to come out because people need to understand it better. So I would urge companies and people, even within families and within your friends, to really have a sit down, have a one-on-one conversation with someone, have a group conversation, suspend your right to be offended, and get at some of the things that are being perceived out there and try to dispel the myths. What are some of those myths? What are some of the things that are offensive, and why? And go right after it. And I think that would really help us a lot in this climate that we happen to be in today. And the climate is getting, I think, a little more divisive, not less divisive, and it's because of that lack of understanding.
I want to dig a little bit deeper into some of the specific strategies that you told us about that you said were really key to the effectiveness you've had it within RSM and maybe even the accounting community at large. But one of them you talked about was the importance of leadership involvement if this is going to work. And so maybe tell the folks on the call, how do you get a leader on board? What did you do and how important was that? And maybe even a little bit about the team of leaders that you have around you.
Yeah. You know, when I look at the success of our program over the past 6 years, we started it 6 years ago, it's been just overwhelming. It's been an overwhelming success in the acceptance and the amount of involvement by our people. We have over half of our people in our firm are involved with our employee network group programs, and that's a huge percentage for a professional service firm. When I look at the key success factors, number one was absolutely the fact that our CEO got behind it from the beginning. He got behind it, he embraced it, and he demonstrated that. He demonstrated it by his words, his actions, and everything else that he did. D&I has been talked about. We call it culture, diversity, and inclusion. You know, it's just our own acronym. We call it CDI. CDI has been talked about by Joe Adams in every single talk he's given since we started the program 6 years ago. Every single talk, every town meeting we've had, every annual report, every address that we have to various offices, every single discussion has had D&I in it. D&I was made a strategic priority for the firm 6 years ago. I was appointed to the leadership team so that we could have that input 6 years ago. And what happened was once Joe got behind it, everybody said, well, this isn't just a flavor of the day. We just didn't have someone come in and say, we're going to start this program and it's going to go away in 2 years like all the other things do. No, this is for real. This is sticking because Joe's talking about it all the time. And so it must be important. We now have a CFO, a COO, our entire leadership team committed to D&I. They go to the meetings. They're on the phone calls. Right now we have what we call a CEO panel on racial equity and social injustice. And Joe Adams leads that. COO is on every call. They are on every call. It happens once a week for an hour and a half. And we talk about what we're doing to make this real in our firm, and what we're doing to face the challenges that we face in terms of the racial unrest that we have today. So leadership is really important. The second thing is you need to devote resources to it. And I was fortunate that I had the resources. We did focus group meetings to find out what it was that our people wanted. Not what the leadership team wants this to look like. What do the people want this to look like? And those focus group meetings gave us a lot of insight as to what direction we should go in. And I met a woman who worked for us. Her name is Tracy Walker. And I immediately knew 6 years ago that Tracy had to work on this in order for it to be successful. So I asked Joe, I said, you know, Tracy needs to be transferred to our group. We need her full time. She's a director. I want her on our team. Fine, you have her. Next day I had Tracy. Tracy has been amazing. She's developed all of our educational courses, and she now leads a team of 8 people devoted just to diversity and inclusion in our firm. So it takes resources, number 2, and they have to be good resources. They have to be really committed to it. And number 3, I think you have to listen to the people. And I said, this became a people's movement. It had nothing to do with my opinions or Tracy's opinions. It had everything to do with what our people wanted. And that's really key. And if you don't know what they want, ask them. They'll tell you.
That's great. What I love so much about all of this is that I look at how far you've come in the last 6, 7, 8 years from just getting started in D&I to where you are now and what you've accomplished and what you've been able to achieve. You told a story to Phil and I when we initially spoke that I got a kick out of, just talking about where you were at then versus where you're at now. Do you remember when you were doing a Q&A with the group and they asked you about LGBT?
Yeah, yeah.
Will you
So-
share that with everyone, please?
So it was when I was vice chairman of the AICPA, I announced that we were going to, so this is in 2011, I announced that we were going to make my platform about diversity and inclusion. We're forming the National Commission on Diversity and Inclusion. We're going to have a team. We're going to write about it. We're going to have something called Inclusion Solutions, which was a newsletter. And that was the whole plan. I laid it all out. And a woman in the audience raised her hand and she said, will your program include LGBT? So I looked around the room, I thought about it. I didn't know what LGBT meant. I had no idea what the acronym was. And so I looked at Janice, who was a public relations director, and Janice is nodding her head up and down. So I said, yes, of course it will include LGBT. So after the meeting, I went up to Janice and I said, what is LGBT? And she told me what it was. And I said, oh, okay, well, I'm glad we're including it. And from there, you know, I learned so much. Like I said, I had a lot to learn, and I learned so much from our LGBT group. Our pride group, we call it, our LGBT group. And in general, at the AICPA, the LGBT group challenge was, believe it or not, it was probably the most challenging part of implementing D&I at the AICPA and also at RSM to some extent. But now it's probably one of the most successful. I think people have come to, and the reason why it is, I think it's because of understanding. I think people have come to understand a lot of things about the LGBTQ community that there were previously misconceptions on. And frankly, it's been one of the more rewarding things to see happen is the acceptance of the LGBTQ community profession-wide and certainly within our firm. So we have many people in leadership positions that are part of the community, and that part of it has been extremely rewarding.
That's great. Thank you for sharing that. Phil and I just got a kick out of it because it just shows that learning and growing and understanding, it starts somewhere. It doesn't just happen.
Yeah,
and I think that's such a great anecdote.
We weren't born with that acronym in our mind, I guess. So, especially where I came from. It's true.
Yeah. You know, there was just a comment that someone came in about the importance of humility. And Rich, I think I really appreciated getting to know you a little bit better. And I think you're effective, but probably humble. And one of the things that I'll just take the liberty to share with the folks that are on this call, the reason I asked earlier the question about leadership and how important that is it takes real leaders to move the needle. And anyone on this call, whether your position says so or not, you have the potential to be a leader just by virtue of your courage, your strength, and standing up for what's right. And Rich shared a story with us where when they first were presenting the idea of a pride organization at their pride resource group within RSM, there were a handful of people that stood in opposition to it and said, well, if you do this, we're going to resign. And Rich, share how again did you reply to that?
We sent them the procedure for how to go about doing that. And we heard from them again, but it happens. It happened at the AICPA as well, and we actually did have a member resign over it. But the other members, I just simply sent them, here's what you need to do to resign, and we wish you the best. That's it. And I never heard from them again. So I think they've now, so many people have changed their position on that. It's really encouraging to see the progress. But every time you think you've come a long way, you realize how far we still have to go. And So things still happen where you say, yeah, we still have some work to do. And so we know that too. And we're still working on it.
And I think as human beings, that will be the narrative always. There's always room for growth.
Always. Yeah.
Bettering our best as we can.
It's sort of like golf. You know, I play a lot of golf and I'm still bad at it. And every once in a while you have a day where you say, wow, I finally figured this out. And then the next day it disappears again.
Yeah.
It's still got a lot of work to do. It's the same thing. Every day, you know, nothing surprises me anymore. Right. In the D&I world. And you wake up every day and say, yeah, there's still a lot to do.
Yeah, so true. We've got a handful of questions coming in. I want to ask you one more question before we get to our questions, but and some of our concluding remarks. Here, as Scott has said, our work at BridgeWorks for 22 years has been about creating what we've always referred to as these aha moments. There are these generational blind spots or clash points that we refer to them as, where people just aren't seeing eye to eye. And we come in and we help explain where that thinking has come from, what experiences resulted in this sense of thinking. And then all of a sudden the lights go on and people transition from a place of, I don't understand them, they make me so mad, to, oh, now I get it. They're not meaning to frustrate me. They're not meaning to upset me. They just had a different set of experiences. And something you said the first time that we spoke that really stood out to me, you said you have a mission to create understanding over agreement. And would you mind just speaking a little bit to some of the examples in which how you facilitated that? Because that's so important if we are going to get along in this world.
Yeah, that's right. It is important because I think it's really difficult to change anybody's mind on how they feel about a particular sensitive issue. But you can help them understand why you feel about the way you feel about a sensitive issue. And if they can understand that better, they won't change their mind, but they'll have a better tolerance. They'll like you. They won't be angry at you. They won't be mad at you. And I think a couple of really good examples of that is when the Colin Kaepernick situation was at its height. It was in the middle of me taking this on at RSM. And so a few years ago, we did, the first idea I had was, let's invite Colin Kaepernick to come and speak, because he probably doesn't have much to do, and I'm sure he'd like to make a little extra money. And Tracy Walker said to me, no, that's crazy. You're not going to do that. That would be a disaster. But why don't we reenact it? And so we'll have someone role play Colin Kaepernick and role play an Army general. So we had Charles Barley, who heads our African American Center of Excellence, and we had the Army General Pete Pfeiffer, who was a former Green Beret, and they stood on the stage in front of all of our diversity and inclusion leadership, a couple of hundred people. The lights went out, the spotlight went on them, and they played the national anthem. And Charles took a knee, and Pete did the salute. And when they were all finished, they had a conversation. They didn't have a debate. They had a conversation about why each of them felt the need to do what they did. Why did Pete find the need to salute the flag and stand at attention? Why did Charles find the need to take a knee? And when they were finished with the conversation, there was dead silence in the room. When they were finished with the conversation, I don't think anybody changed their mind. If you thought it was inappropriate to take a knee from the flag before, you still felt that way when you were finished. If you thought it was the right thing to do, you still felt that way at the end. But everybody understood it better. Everybody understood why Charles took the knee. And when they got to understand that, they felt different about it. They just felt better about it. And they felt that I can understand why he did that. I don't think it was really good thing to do. I don't think it was right. I wouldn't do that, but I understand why he did it, and I respect him for it. And so that understanding, out of that understanding came respect. Out of that respect came the desire and ability to work better together and to have more conversations like that. And that's what I think we're trying to do, is just create that sense of understanding. You know, it's funny, our tagline at our firm has been for the last decade, the power of being understood. And it is a really powerful thing to understand. And there's a saying that I'm sure it developed somewhere in Greece, but Stephen Covey perfected it in a book. And the saying is to seek first to understand, then be understood. So it's hard really to be understood. It's hard for people to understand you if you don't understand them. So seek first to understand, and then you can be understood. And it's so true. It is a really powerful thing. And again, the only way to do that is to make it happen, have those conversations and play them out. So that's probably the most powerful example. There are others, and you know, it's just an amazing thing to see happen. What was interesting about what we did was we didn't tell anybody we were going to do it, because we were fearful that someone would say, you can't do that, you shouldn't do that, or don't do that. So we said, you know, we're going to do it, and we'll just see how it plays out. So they wouldn't let us record it. So we didn't record it. And the first question our CEO asked after we did the session was, because he was there, he said, I hope you recorded that. And I said, no, sorry, we didn't record it. And I don't think you could ever, it's something that would be tough to duplicate. Like you couldn't do it over again as effective as it was, but it was really something. People had tears in their eyes when they finally understood. So it was a good time.
It sounds like a powerful event, and I'm so glad that you shared that story again. And one of the highlights for me when you share it is the importance of discussion over debate. I'm sure the reason people would have been afraid if you told them we were going to do this is our whole society is expecting a debate. We're expecting an argument that I have to convince you that I'm right. But a true discussion creates understanding, which you said creates respect. And before we open it up to questions, because I know we've had several come in, I've kind of subtly been reading them, and there's some good ones coming. I just kind of want to put a quick period on just everything that we've shared so far in the context of what we're doing at BridgeWorks to do this. You'll see, hopefully you've gotten the link if you're on this call to the first blog that we wrote in our DE&I series, and it's just about when generations and diversity connect, where they kind of intersect. And one of the questions that came in preparation for today, this is, I'm not sure if they're male or female, but as a millennial, I do feel there's been a higher expectation of making sure companies or management are addressing the current issues, while others may feel there's a fine line that crosses over into politics. So how do you balance that in making sure the needs of all generations are being met? And the story you just shared is a great starting point, right? Discussion over debate. Let's learn to listen and understand one another. Some of the highlights from the blog that we wrote speak to this. And one of the reasons why we love leading into this topic with generations is because it, by its very nature, is inclusive. And I think this person who's asking this question is already on the right path, because they're taking into the context everyone, not just their perspective, but what might other people think about this. And our solutions are often, they're never a one size fits all. We try to understand that each generation has had different experiences. Each lens of diversity has different experiences. And how do you adapt and make sure everyone feels included? How do you set people up for success when you have those conversations? And one of the questions that I saw just came in was what's that saying that you have? And we'll share it again, but I'll quote you here, Rich. You say, every time you go into a courageous conversation, you start with suspend your right to be offended, but tell me why. Right? So it's not just, you don't have the right to be offended, but when you feel it, I'm open to listening, to understanding why that might be, have stung you like those so many mosquitoes that you described. And lastly, provide something constant that people can hold on to. I thought it was funny early on when you described how you first came into this, you were a part of the Minorities Initiative Commission. Now, I think 8 to 10 years ago is when you had that encounter. We would never call it that anymore, right? It's
Right.
work, our language is constantly evolving, but people need something solid and consistent to hold on to. And that's just another great support. You want to find that common ground that people can believe in and go with. And we speak to that in our blog. So with that, should we have a few minutes for some questions and answers?
Yeah.
I think that sounds great. Phil, there are so many that have come in. Hopefully we can get to as many as we possibly can. Rich, the first one I have for you, and I like this one because it's something Phil and I address when we meet with clients all the time. Patrick asks, how important do you think it is to focus on similarities instead of differences? I'd love to hear your thoughts on that, Rich.
Yeah, I think it's really important. And it's really, I think with respect to all of the different network groups that we have 11 different employee network groups, from veterans, generations, family first, and so forth. When you start talking, they talk a lot about the similarities. And the similarities is the glue that puts them together and gives them something in common. So it's a really good point, and we didn't talk a lot about that, but talking about the similarities, talking about the positive versus the negative, talking about the things that are that we have in common. There's so much we have in common, no matter who we are, and that really puts the focus on the positive and creates a different atmosphere in the room. So I think that's critically important, and I should have mentioned that, but within the groups they do a lot of that, talking about what we have in common and how we can use that as a strength and an opportunity. So right on point.
That's great. I think a lot of times, people kind of gravitate toward those differences rather than focusing in on all these things that we actually do have in common. And at the end of the day, oftentimes want the same things, and we just get so caught up in these differences that we sometimes need to be reminded about what those commonalities are. Another great question here. What do you find most effective for discerning perceived prejudices versus actual prejudice? Do you have any thoughts on that?
That's a tough one. And
it is.
Yeah, it's a real tough one. I think we try to make sure that when you talk about treating people equally, we believe in the concept of obviously treating people equitably. And when we have a notion that there's any type of prejudice happening, we try to search it, make it come to the surface. But it's tough. I think it's really tough. And I think again, it goes back to the understanding. If there's a perceived prejudice, then creating that sense of understanding might help resolve that. Maybe the prejudice isn't real. It's just the way someone's feeling because of the microaggressions. And it's something, again, it all goes back to the same solution of that sense of understanding. I don't have any real good answers for that.
No, that's a great answer, actually. That's not a softball question that they asked, for sure. And thank you for tackling that one. This one from Nicole. I found that newer generations like Millennials and Gen Z are willing to talk about diversity and other social issues, but it's hard to get Gen Xers like Phil and myself, our Xers and Boomers, to engage in those conversations. Have you noticed that, or do you have any advice for getting maybe more established generations who've been in the workplace a lot longer to have these conversations that probably were not taking place when they were newer in the workplace?
Right. And this is sort of like my golf swing analogy. A lot of people say, well, salvation is going to be the new generations because the new generations don't have that same sense of divisiveness that the Gen X and baby boomers had. And you go out and find that's not universally true. I think a lot of it depends on their background, their experiences in life, the way they were brought up, where they came from, their beliefs. So some of that still exists, and I've come to not be as optimistic as some people that the newer generation is going to be so different from the current generations that the diversity and inclusion can just kind of go away, right? So I don't believe that's true, but it's certainly true that they're willing to engage in deeper conversations about it. So when we have our town hall meetings, that's a very vocal group. Would be the Gen Y, Gen Z is more vocal than the baby boomers are. But I'll tell you, you get the baby boomers and the Gen X going, and they'll start to talk about it because I think they want to understand. It's just that they weren't brought up that way to have those conversations. So it is a little more difficult. But once they get going on it, we find that they get into it. And, you know, we had a good story actually in our Minneapolis office where we had someone from my generation attend a generations group network event. He's a very conservative person and never really wanted to engage in that type of conversation. And the generations group got him going. And he started talking about it, and he started understanding the differences. And he walked out saying, I learned a lot. I learned a lot in that meeting. And, you know, I was surprised at what I learned. And then he started getting involved with the other network groups because he wanted to understand more about the other groups. So I think it just takes a little practice from some of us Gen X and baby boomers. A little bit of practice, we'll get better at it and go for that understanding. So I think we all want to understand more about it.
I would agree with that. I know Phil and I, shortly after quarantine really hit, we're doing webinars and sessions for clients just about communicating and establishing ourselves in times of crisis. And one of the things we talked about in great detail was these younger generations, Gen Z, younger millennials, talking even about things like mental health. These things that were once kind of taboo topics we didn't talk about at work are now, it's open season and they want to talk about it and they want answers. So it's kind of forcing some of us who have maybe been more reserved in those areas to start to listen and open up more.
Sure.
Phil, do you think we have time for one more?
Yeah, I just want to jump on that last thought though real quick.
Yeah, please.
Partly by way of plug, we have another blog specifically on how the evolution of D&I across the generations. So please check that out. And the reason I'm bringing it up, and I'm glad, Rich, you said it the way you did, many times we do look to the next generation as the savior, and it almost undervalues or devalues the contribution that each generation has made and can continue to make. And that's something that we really believe is important across every conversation of DE&I, is you have to let everyone know that their voice matters, that they do have something to offer here. And when you just say only this group of people can contribute, you kind of take away the real power of what we're trying to do, is understand each other and together create a unified solution. So go ahead and check that next blog out, but also very important to know that while young people are so engaged in this conversation, everyone has something to offer.
Absolutely. I think this will probably be our last question here. And I had to really decipher which one to ask, but this is a good one because it's come up a few times. You talked about when it comes to diversity, equity, inclusion, your best piece of advice was getting support from leadership, in particular your CEO. What is a good strategy to really get leadership on board when it comes to these topics and these programs? Any advice for anybody who maybe doesn't have that CEO who's like, yep, I'm on board?
Yeah. And, you know, I was lucky because my CEO saw the same vision that I did. But Tim Ryan, who is the chairman of PwC, very large accounting and consulting firm, said, if you are a leader today and diversity and inclusion is not one of your priorities, then you won't be a leader for long. And I think what it would be good to talk to the CEO about is obsolescence of the CEO and the fact that there is a business case for D&I. The world is moving toward placing more importance on D&I, not less. There are businesses who won't do business with you unless it is a priority for you. There are people who won't come to work for you unless it is a priority for you. And so what I would say is you have to make the business case for the doubting CEO. And if you make that business case and you can't get he or she there, then from there you go to the people who influence that CEO, and the people of influence someone has to buy in to convince the CEO. If you still don't get there, I would just find another company. Find another company to work for. That's my opinion. Because
you hit on something that Phil and we talk about all the time with young talent now. Diversity and inclusion and having these programs, it's not a perk or a great bonus. It's a baseline expectation for the best young talent you could possibly hope to recruit. So this is a bottom line issue. It's not just something, a fluffy thing for your company. It impacts the bottom line hands down. So thank you for sharing that.
The other part about the diversity, beside the business case, is the solution to problems. And so we have a weekly meeting with the CEO on the racial issues that are facing us today. And there are 7 people on the call. It is a diverse group of people on the call. And what happens is an idea pops up, and then everybody on the call makes that idea better because they're coming from a different perspective. And by the time we're finished with the call, we've got an unbelievable idea, and we know how to implement it. It is because 7 people had 7 different perspectives. They didn't all have the same perspective, and they're not afraid to speak up and share this perspective. So all this leads to that frank and honest discussion, and being able to put yourself out there and not afraid to make a mistake and throw your idea out there. And I think it's just for the overall good health of the company.
Great.
Well, that is a solid place to land on. I was kind of catching up on some of the comments. And again, I love, Rich, your dedication to this in the sense of you have the courage to make hold boldly to your convictions. And I think that's why it's been so effective. Out of 11,000 people at RSM, 7,000 of them are participating in your employee resource groups. That's just outstanding. You've created an environment, or helped to create an environment, where people, everyone finds a home and engages in these discussions. And we've been so honored to have you with us today. So thank you so much for joining us. And
Thank you.
Thank you, Rich. Thank you to RSM for sharing you with us today.
Yes.
Yes. We're very lucky.
Happy to do so.
Yes. And thank you to everybody who tuned in today. It was our pleasure, and stay tuned. We got more of these coming up in the future.